Well, the story of Jacob's ladder, as it is found in the Old Testament, opens quite a field of inquiry. We can't really hope to cover all the aspects of it, but we want to bring out a few of the points which have a bearing, perhaps, upon our own futures. In the first place, science today is completely physical, not only in its attitudes, but in its areas of activity. It assumes that the physical world as we see it, with the attendant celestial phenomena, is the reality. The physical problems are real. Everything else is speculation of some kind. Now we go further and further out into space. We come in contact with a variety of previously unknown phenomena, but it's all physical. It is all some kind of expansion to be conquered by scientific advancements, by the creation of newer and improved instruments of investigation, and by continual recognition of the scientific method. Without this method, we are seriously handicapped. Now, in anthropology, we are having a little trouble now with method, too, because the Darwinian theory is falling apart, and no one knows what to put in its place. But regardless of what we do, we are working in physical matter, with physical instruments, surrounded by something we don't understand. To the material scientist, the physical existence extends to the ultimate, absolute extremity of conditioned existence. It goes on and on and on, beyond all the solar systems and all the nebulae that we can possibly imagine. But everything is physical. It is all to be estimated by the vision of the beholder, supported by scientific equipment. So here we have a rather interesting problem. We'll take a chart, for instance, supposing we have a picture that a scientist takes of the solar system. We have numerous such pictures. They have them in all of the observatories and planetariums and all these places. It looks like just a flat map with one circle after another representing the orbits of planets, with various markings to indicate certain fixed stars that are valuable. But all of these markings are on a flat surface. They're in 1 or 2 dimensions at most. And in this 2-dimensional locking of pictographs of various kinds, we get no assurance or insight into what lies beyond. The ancients had one up on us. They recognized that there was something we didn't see, that we couldn't see under normal conditions, and that the visible universe is only a manifestation or a tail end appendage of something infinitely greater. Now, this infinitely greater has up to now defied scientific investigation, although every once in a while somebody lifts a corner of the mystery, takes a quick look, and drops the corner again. We do not know exactly what is out there, but it is becoming more evident that there is something beyond what we can see. If there is something that we can't see, then we are not in the condition to come to final estimations of the world in which we live. If we cannot see beyond the physical, and there is something beyond the physical, it becomes more or less probable that whatever that is that we don't see is the cause of that which we do see. This is an irritating thought, but still you can't completely disregard it. So we come to the idea that the ancients had, and we had ourselves down to the time of Copernicus and Galileo, that the physical universe was only a small part of creation, that the rest of it was just as real, but not within the range of our sensory perceptions under normal conditions. Occasionally, someone with an extra sense has brought back information of great interest, but it wasn't possible to settle it down into science because it was another dimension and would not fit into the two-dimensional world of modern physical research. So gradually, there has come about a restoration of certain aspects of ancient learning. We are beginning to recognize that there were many very admirable scholars in ancient times who, if they were not psychic, at least had trained the intellect to the recognition of certain values. Now, to train a mind is very important, but what you train it for is still more important. If you train a mind to see only the visible, that is all that it will see. If we train the mind, however, to believe and to see that which is outside of physical matter, something that is not immediately tangible to the objective sight, then we can perhaps rationalize on a number of important points. And the ancients did a great deal of this rationalization. Without the instruments without which we could not function, without the background of centuries of research, they did some of the most important basic thinking we have in the world of science. Pythagoras with his mathematics and Ptolemy with his astronomy were true great pioneers in the search for the facts about existence. Now, if we take it for granted that the physical world is only a part of something, that it is only the physical manifestation of a vast invisible structure, the thought is not as bewildering as one might think. Even physically, the magnitude of the universe is inconceivable. And if we wish to recognize that it is just more inconceivable than we thought, there will be a certain amount of interest on the matter. Now, in the ancient world, we find a gradual development of a law of analogy. As above, so below. As in the heavens, so on the earth. As in the sky, so in the body of man. As it is in the universe, so it is in the strings of a violin. The colors, the elements, everything we know are in orderly sequences. There is a tremendous series of symbols, each symbolizing not only itself but other things. And this was developed strongly in Asia and also strongly by the mystics of the Middle Ages in Europe. It suddenly became obvious, to some at least, that the universe was a great being and that man was a miniature universe. This analogy was the basis of most early research, and it is this analogy that has gradually faded away under the pressure of intense visualization of material things. Yet the body of man is not all of man, or he would not be worth considering. The body of the universe cannot be all of the universe, or it would not exert invisible laws upon visible things. Everywhere there is an indication that there is something beyond, something behind, and something greater than that which can be captured by the physical sensory perceptions. So this brings us now into the story of the ladder. The ladder, of course, is one of the most ancient symbols that we find in the religions of the world. The ladder of Jacob, upon which the angels ascended and descended, is only one of many examples. The same concept as that occurs in the Revelation of John, where we find suddenly the universe stratified into various levels, layers. We remember the night journey of Mohammed to heaven from the rock Moriah, where he goes through the orbits of the 7 planets, and they become the steps of the ladder. We find Ishtar descending through the 7 gates to rescue Amos, the divine in man. We find in the mystics of the Middle Ages, the Rosicrucians, the alchemists, the Kabbalists, always a strange and wonderful story about this septenary mystery of life. We find it even in Homer's Odyssey. We find it in China, in India, in Greece, in Egypt, in Persia. We find it everywhere. This mysterious idea, the layers of which are the steps of a gigantic ladder. Now this ladder, if we are to believe Hermes, the great Egyptian mystic, the thaumaturgist, of whose life nothing is known. But anyway, in his emerald tablet, Hermes declares that the above is like the below, the superior is like the inferior, the lesser is like the greater is like the lesser. All things follow one immense pattern, and if anyone can break the mystery of that pattern in any one point, any one level, he has the key to the whole mystery. So for centuries men sought this key. Some believe they found it. There are many strange records of such discoveries. But gradually the majority of human beings became discouraged, disillusioned, locked within the band of sensory materialism. They gradually came in the end to a blind mystery. They could go so far and no further, and that which they sought faded away into the unknown. So to save themselves from the continual frustration on this level, most thinkers have finally decided to accept the physical universe as the great mystery and spend the ages now and to come trying to solve step by step the chemistry, the mathematics, the electronics of the universe. Now, in this particular point, we have two very great texts to work with. We have a realization of this in the complete miniature of life, which we call the human being. It has always been held in mysticism that the human being was a miniature of life, that anyone who could completely solve man could solve all other things. But at the moment, no one really seems to be that interested in solving man. The great purpose today is to fit man into the economic empire which we have created in this world. It is not what a man is that counts now. It's what he's worth by the hour. It is not really an effort to unfold the mystery of the internal of the human being, but merely to find remedies for his external ailments and to do what we could to extend his material existence. All of these things were secondary, but they became primary as individuals were disappointed one after another when they tried to explore the invisible causes of life. But in the philosophies of most nations, there has been this recognition that the solar system, the human body, and space itself are identical in law, identical in principles, differing only in magnitudes, and that we can explore them a little more carefully if we so desire. The Ptolemaic system of astronomy gradually verged into astrology, because astronomy had to do with what you did in this world, but very often it was inadequate. Astrology was not capable of solving the mysteries of human destiny. It could only proclaim them, or occasionally make a dramatic interpretation of some event. But actually, the astrology of the ancients was a form of psychology. As astronomy is a science, so astrology was a psychological philosophy. It had to do not with the visible forms of the solar system, but with principles, mathematically, scientifically, and hieroglyphically set forth. These researches, particularly those of Ptolemy of Alexandria, probably one of the first greatest astronomers, these researches were not primarily intended for prognostics. They were an effort to find out how the universe functioned, where all things come from, why and where they are going. And in order to do this, a new concept of the universe was gradually brought into existence. There is a very fine example of this concept in the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1498. This was the first encyclopedia and the first book of general knowledge, and the very beginning of it is this picture of the universe as it was to these people, mingling what they knew of science, but what was not yet scientific, and therefore got themselves labeled as superstitious fools by the more accurate modern researchers. So all the work of these older ones has been more or less downgraded, simply because it is assumed that they had not sense enough to be materialists, and that the materialism was the final proof of intelligence. Well, we're in a little bit of a bind right now on this point. We're not at all sure today that materialism is the solution of anything. It only seems to complicate things until no one can solve them. But now we go to the picture of the universe, as it was in the Nuremberg Chronicle and in early editions of astrological works which preceded Kepler and Tycho Brahe. And we find what? We find a series that looks like of interrelating circles, looking very much like the rings of a target. These rings were concentric, and in ancient times the earth was placed in the center, and around the earth in rings were the orbits of the 7 planets of that time, of which only 5 were actual planets. The Chinese had somewhat similar designs, but preferred to use squares and triangles. But this target-like solar system was the Placidian system of ancient days. It began on the face of the earth, and a ladder ascended from the surface of the earth to the extremity of the solar system, which to these people was the planet of Saturn. Above Saturn, they had the empyrean, bordered on the inner glass, the world of the heavenly realms and regions, the abodes of deity. Therefore, there were these 7 rings, concentric circles, ascending in order from the face of the earth, through the orbits of the moon, and then Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, and finally Saturn. This was the target-like design, which for hundreds of years completely satisfied the needs of a world devoted to inward growth rather than to scientific complications. Now, this target-like device, with its various rings, inspired a number of useful discoveries. Apparently, it impelled Pythagoras to discover the octave, or the mystery of musical harmony. It permitted him also to discover the principal chords, and by stretching a thread or cord from the face of the earth to the upper end of the orbit of Saturn, he created a cosmic musical instrument. This has been reproduced in design and with diagrams of many values by Robert Fludd, the English Rosicrucian of the 17th century. Also, Fludd then took this design and laid it on the human body and came to the conclusion that the 7-fold division of Pythagoras was equally applicable to the physical structure of the human being, not only his composition, but his actual physical body. Little by little, therefore, this septenary system took over as a means of discovering the essential pattern behind life, to find out, if possible, what was good and what was evil, what was real, what was unreal, what was honorable, what was false. All these things were involved in the 7 deadly sins, the 7 cardinal virtues, one of which in each case was attributed to the planets. So they made a kind of moral universe by bringing all the moralities of life into the planetary structure. They also divided it into areas for continents. They divided the oceans from the land. They created the octave and set up the frets to discover the upper and lower octaves of music. They created a scale of sound, a palette of 7 colors. They developed all types of septenaries, and these septenaries are still more or less valuable. They knew the 7 senses. They also knew the 7 psychic powers of the human being. Everything was developed from a grand diagram. And when that diagram came down to us as on a flat sheet of paper, with the orbits of the planets and the elements indicated, and the empyrean or the divine realms above, the modern astronomer looked at it for a moment and said, it's rubbish. It's not the way solar is at all. This isn't it. This is pure fiction. Well, it may not be fiction, for the reason that reality may not be physical. And no matter how far we go, or how many planets or parts of the universe we discover, we may not have the answer. So instead of ridiculing this old idea, some have taken it and created from it formulas for the reconstruction of life. Now, we know that the ancient mysteries were the sacred institutions of knowledge. They were the universities. They were the gymnasium of education. They were all things to those who sought to know. So these ancient institutions accepted disciples into their structure by a system of rites or tests called initiations. And now, in most cases, these initiations were 7 in number, and they advanced from the material to the most abstract. They formed the rungs of a ladder of growth, a ladder of unfolding internal potentials. The disciple ascended the ladder by overcoming the negative attributes of each of the 7 planets. He learned how to use knowledge and not abuse it. He learned to understand the difference between love and lust. He also sought to understand the difference between education and knowledge. These things gradually developed in many countries. In Babylonia, the goddess Ishtar descends through the 7 gates to rescue the dying Attis or Adonis. The 7 different levels, like Muhammad, climbing the 7 rungs that fell from the sky, which led him up to the uppermost, and at each of the 7 gates was one of the 7 patriarchs of the Old Testament. But when he came to the 7th gate, so strangely enough, in a Muslim book, the guardian of that gate was Christ. Now all this has something to do with astronomy, because the ancient charts show these gates as parts of the orbits of the planets, the psychological universe lying behind the literal one. We find everywhere in the mysteries of Mithras the steps. The Mithraic philosophy reached Great Britain, and there still in the great houses of parliament and law are the symbols of the ancient rites. The Templar's headquarters in London was a place of initiation with 7 steps. All of these things remind us that these steps represent qualities. These qualities each rotates around its own sun. The emotional universe rotates around the intellectual or mercurial world. Everything works in an orderly manner. Now we go into the human body, and this is what the Buddhists call the mysterious cave of 7 parts. The 7 parts are the organs of the human body recognized by the ancients. These 7 vital organs are strengthened and intensified in their functions by the contributions of 7 endocrine glands. Every part of the system works together, and to get a key to one part comes far towards opening all the rest of the mystery. We know that some of it has even reached into modern anatomy in names and words. We know about the pia mater in the brain, the thin, gentle, or kindly mother. We know also that the upper axis of the spine, where it joins the skull, was known even in science as the pyramid. All kinds of strange things. The spinal column, with its 33 segments, still corresponding with the degrees of the ancient mystery systems. So we have all kinds of things to think about relating to this ascent from the superficial to the essential. This descent, which is a mystical experience, as John expresses it in the Revelation. The Revelation of John is almost a completely Gnostic work, dealing with initiations into the Gnostic rites. John is picked up and carried through the spheres and comes finally to the gates of the Empyrean. And there the upper world is revealed to him. All of this was part of the philosophy of antiquity. Now we can go back to the modern world and we can say, but there doesn't seem to be any proof of this. There doesn't seem to be any reason why we should expect to find something strange and mysterious at the top of this mysterious ladder that we talk about climbing. The ladder that was known to be pointing up to what the Egyptians called the Jewel of 7 Stars, which formed a constellation at the head of the ladder. All this was part of something. Here we have in India the mystery of the 7 chakras, aligned along the sympathetic parts of the gangliated structure. We also find the mysterious yogas, 7 yogas, tied into these 7 gangliated centers. Everywhere 7 days of creation. And all these things tie into something that we are trying to put together to find out what kind of a world we live in. For a long time it didn't really mean too much to us. We were getting along pretty well. The Bible told us that we would live 70 years. Well, when they came time to translate the Old Testament, the high priest Eliezer selected 70 elders to make the translation. And the first translation of the Jewish Bible is called the Septuagint, or the work of the 70. Every time you look around, you find 70. You find some reason for it. Now, in some cases, it is obvious that it is arbitrary. But it can't be arbitrary in all cases, because it ties into too many vital facts that we know in our daily experience. We know the octaves of elements just as truly as we do them in music. So out of all of this, there comes this vague suspicion that there might be some way of breaking through this mystery to find out something about the reality of ourselves. Even old Omar in his Rubaiyat describes that he went through the orbits of the planets and sat upon the throne of Saturn. Everywhere we have this same analogy, east, west, north, and south, and it means something. We know the ancients recognized 7 races. They also recognized 7 continents. All the way through, the septenary had to hold true. Now, what does that mean, perhaps, in our own thinking today? Suppose we assume that the individual himself has a septenary of faculties, that he has various levels of insights, that he has various ways of measuring things, and that all these, except the visible faculties, are invisible. That somewhere there must be an answer. It is not possible to assume religiously that this creation is without a cause. And it is not possible scientifically to prove with any degree of inclusiveness that everything that exists is merely an accident, that things just happened. Things don't just happen, because there are too many evidences every day that things happen according to rules. And today there are many, many people who have experienced what we would commonly call miracles, simply because they intuitively kept the facts of life straight, whereas somebody else had mixed it up for themselves. So we have this problem of trying to understand the rights of the mysteries, how to penetrate into this structure and see why it answers all questions if we find out the key to them. Now, the key, it begins with a very simple point. It begins with the earth. The earth is the foundation upon which the ladder rests. And in man, the physical body is the foundation upon which the ladder of his spinal cord and column rests. It is also true that this physical situation that we have is the beginning of something, that all through the universe there is an interplay of various forces and factors. The other planets of the solar system certainly have mutual influence on each other. Therefore, the whole universe is one tightly tied bundle of processes. There is nothing accidental, incidental, or unimportant in this process. It is a complete integration of purposes. Now, for man, what is the purpose? Why is he settled here? Why is he in the problems he's in today? And why are these problems being pressed upon him to the point of his final solution of them? The answer is that man is here, like everything else in the universe, to grow. There is a purpose for him. The life of man is not merely a brief interlude between the cradle and the grave. The individual, by being born, living, and finally casting off this body, is not merely an accident of nature. It is not simply something that happens. And this is equally true when you study the cross-section of the eye of a fly. A magnificent mathematical pattern. That pattern is not an accident. Procreation is not an accident. Growth, maturity, the release of all kinds of attitudes and processes in our own thinking, these are not all accidents. The main problem, the greatest cause of accidents probably that we have, is that we have been gradually trained to ignore the testimonies that would lead us in the direction of truth. We are trained to be materialistic. If we do not believe that life is a vast futility, we are out of harmony with contemporary thinking. All other idealists are therefore merely dreamers, hoping, fearing, wondering. But the facts are that the physical universe alone is real. This is no longer tenable. We can't do it and face the national problems we have. We cannot understand the reason for ourselves until we discover that there is a reason for everything. We cannot solve the problems of government until we fit them into the great septenary pattern of existence. The final 7 laws that govern life must be adapted to the 7 rules which govern a nation or a community or finally the individual himself. All these things are part of an inflexible design. To ignore it is simply to suffer. It could give us answers, but if we do not search for those answers, we are simply victims of what we like to call accidents. There are no accidents. Everything has some reason for it. Something has happened to make it necessary. Now this is what the ancient Hindus called the wheel of necessity. That we are all on a cyclic pattern of needs, of things we have to learn and things we have to do. And there is no graduation from this school until we do what we ought to do and find out the answers to the things that we must know. Otherwise, we are always going to fall short of that which is necessary to release us from the painful cycle of necessity. Necessity has only one solution, one remedy, and that is to accomplish that which is necessary. Once we keep pact with necessity, all other things will come into order. Now today in world affairs there are necessities. These we are carefully ignoring because they interfere with our personal objectives. And yet we are going along breaking rules and suffering and blaming it all upon the fact that there are no rules, that everything is just a long trail of accidents, and that we will sometime join the past with its 7,000 years. Actually, we have to begin to think of a lawful universe. Now, if a lawful universe exists, its laws must be susceptible of discovery. It must be possible to solve things if the universe has patterns that require solution and demand solution. Nothing is impossible as long as we become aware of what we are trying to accomplish. And if we accomplish correctly, a great many of our problems become minimal. And most of the things we worry about today, crime, poverty, narcotics addiction, alcoholism, all these things will cease if the individual becomes aware of the rules of life. Now, of course, we make laws physically to inhibit crime, to limit or restrict disasters and disorders. But these laws are not laws we love. They do not arise from realities. They arise from legislation and are frequently modified to the benefit of the executives. We are not actually ruled by laws that are primarily solutional to our need. We are following laws that legislators hope will help us to keep the peace without understanding why there is no peace and will not be until things change and become lawful. Now the ancients left us a great diagram of lawfulness. They gave us a wonderful hint. Lord Bacon advanced this, that by assuming definitely that there was a universal intelligence at the source of all things, yet he held some reputation as a scientist, and he proved conclusively that an individual could work definitely and deeply with physics, mathematics, chemistry, and other sciences and still be a good child of the Church of England. The actual answers that we need do not interfere with our effectiveness. They simply make this effectiveness real and permanent. They contribute to the solution of things for which we are all seeking some kind of useful answers. So here we are with a universe so built that it is capable of being understood. And we are here to make what some of the ancient peoples called a pilgrimage. Now the pilgrimage is an ascent through the rungs of the ladder. A pilgrimage is a pattern of growth. It is a pattern of realities. And in Japan and China, the Buddhists make pilgrimages. These pilgrimages are for refreshments, and they are journeys from one sacred place to another, with the understanding that through the inward contemplation of the journey, the individual becomes aware of the eternal journey within himself, which must finally bring him home. As we find also in Homer's definition of the journeys of Ulysses, where he says the great hero of Troy set sail again for his own far distant native land. Well, this far distant native land is in a sense the new world, a new world of peace and order and integrities, based upon a fact that there are reasons that we are not required to do what other things do, because we can see what they do, but we cannot see what we do. We are not expected to take everything on credit. In fact, I think the scientist is more gullible in these respects than the average theologian. The scientist believes anything that another scientist says, whereas the theologian believes only the sayings of his own theology. So he doubts something. But the more conservative attitude at the moment is to try to break through to something. Now, in the midst of all of these problems, whether it be now or 5,000 years ago, we see the similar phenomena occurring. Out of the crisis, out of the strife, out of the stress, the pain, the suffering, the war, the pillage, the massacre, the tyrannies, out of all of these things comes a kind of longing, a yearning in the human heart for peace, a great desire to understand why we are suffering, and to find some way of curing this suffering. But up to now, we haven't realized that we have the suffering, and the cure is limited to the same level as the suffering. We have the chart by which we know we suffer, but the chart of remedies is based upon the same chronology. We are working on one level to have the